Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. As always, support the podcast. You can do that by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. I do a weekly news analysis and report, and we do off-the-record Zoom calls with supporters only. You could donate through the website, crypto, donor box, buy me a coffee, subscribe star, and do check out my exclusive sponsor for this month, Mikkel Thorup's Expat Money Online Summit. It's a free live stream. They do it every year. I'll be participating. You can go to expatmoneysummit.com, throw in your email, register for free, and you can get access to the free live stream. Doug Casey and a whole host of others will be speaking. I'm on one of the VIP panels. The focus this year will be internationalization, and particularly Latin America. If you want the lifetime replays and access to the VIP panels and other perks and benefits, you can use the code EMPIRE, and you'll get 20% off of the VIP upgrade access. Returning to the podcast, or joining us for the first time, I don't know which, is Arnold Schelsky, aka Jobst Landgrebe, to discuss his latest book, The Hype Cycle, Uppers and Downers in Our Bipolar Culture. Excellent book. Just finished reading it. Welcome, Arnold, or Jobst.
Hi, Roy. Great to be with you again. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
So, it's been a while. We talked last time about your fantastic book on AI and that sort of stuff, and why we shouldn't be so afraid. And this book is along those same lines, about hype cycles, about so many things. I'm looking at the contents of the book, science hype, culture hype, everything they're trying to make us afraid. Our AI, transhumanism, quantum computing, globalism, war, multiculturalism. And so tell us a bit perhaps about this book and why you wrote it as Arnold Schelsky.
So I wrote it. First, let me tell you why I use a pseudonym. Because when I wrote it and when it got published, I was afraid of consequences for my, income and my job possibilities due to this book, and which turned out to be true, but not based on the book, but based on other papers I wrote. And so when I saw that my reputation is anyhow, I would say my reputation as an anti-globalist is anyhow established, I can as well now drop the pseudonym for this book. And so this is the reason why I used the pseudonym before, but now it doesn't make sense anymore. Also, I checked again the two most critical and problematic chapters, the one about medical hype and about race hype. And I think if I look at them again, they are really unproblematic. So I'm not afraid of this anymore. But I have 5 kids which I have to feed, so I have to be a bit careful, right? So this is about why I use a pseudonym. Now it's regarding the book. So I have been writing papers about the different problems of the different silly narratives that are invented in our time to create what would call pathological hope and fear. And these are now used as a means of rule. And I will explain a bit later how this works. But basically, I had written a lot of papers. And then I was at the University of Neuchâtel a couple of 2 or 3 years ago giving a talk there. And in the evening, we were going to dinner with the other faculty members. And they asked me, and we discussed some of my theories. And then actually the owner of the restaurant asked me to write a book. He said, "Oh, what you're saying, I haven't heard this before. It sounds great. Can't you write a book?" And then the other said, "Yes, do this." And then I just did it.
I'm curious, how long did it take? You make it sound like, I just, in a week, I just popped out this book.
So it took, I would say, I reused some older papers, but in total, it takes between 500 and 1,000 hours. Right, so roughly a quarter. I think I used half a year of work in total. Right, so it's not nothing to do that, but I think it was worth it. What's a bit special about this book is that the chapters cover very, very different fields of expertise, and scientific expertise, and that reflects my lifelong passion to acquire new types of knowledge. So there's, for example, one chapter about climate hype, and I wrote this chapter because I was so how can I say this, irritated by the IPCC's narratives about climate change, that then at some point 5 years ago I bought a book about climate modeling, which was a physics book, and I just worked through it. Then I understood how the climate models work, and then I could write about it. So I really always ingested the required knowledge. which has to do with my education and background that I'm able to do this. But basically, there's a lot of work from my entire life as a scientist condensed into the book.
And it's a gold mine. I've been going through your book. Highly recommended. There's just so much in there. So many great quotes and analysis that you make. Quotes, your own quotes and synthesis and summary of information. And that there's two basic forms of hype, as you say, hope and fear. And basically, it's most of the stuff that they sell us, whether it's hope like AI utopia or dystopia, fear for control. It's mostly nonsense, hogwash. So we don't have to be afraid of that, but we do have to be afraid of, as you say, most of this hype, AI, climate, gender, multicultural, whatever, death. It's being used for control, and as you refer to, a permanent state of emergency, which I think to take us to this totalitarian world state, which you reference. And so I don't know where to start, but maybe since you mentioned climate and AI, there's a connection there in your book, because you say a lot of the stuff that they talk about for AI and even the climate modeling and projection, it's simply not possible because you need models, but you cannot like model the human brain. You can't model the planet and the weather. So therefore you can't create, a sentient AI or stuff like that. And I have a few quotes. Maybe you say that the economic impact of AI won't be as great as it's currently estimated. We've seen that only regular patterns can be automated using AI. At first glance, it may seem that many human activities are highly repetitive and therefore will be automated using AI. But a more detailed consideration of the processes humans are involved in reveals that many apparently regular processes contain irregular patterns. You also you talk about waves, like in the ocean, in the sea, and how even if you statistically model the waves, you'll never be able to model a future wave because each is different. So if you can tell us more.
Yes. So basically, it's a fundamental idea that was first pronounced by Immanuel Kant in the 1790s, that while we can model certain aspects of inanimate nature, like the planets or other inanimate phenomena, we can't model very well natural phenomena of animate systems, right? He already said that we will never be able to make mathematical models of the growth of a blade of grass. He says in 1790 in his critique of judgment. And he was onto something, and it took another 120 years or so to create a real mathematical foundation to prove that he was right. But basically, what Kant was already noticing at the time is that there's an essential limitation to what we can model mathematically, which has to do with the limits of mathematics. So mathematics is limited by our brain, right? Our brain determines the upper limit of what can mathematically be modeled, and this upper limit, as we know from thermodynamics, is very visible with complex systems. And both the human brain or the human mind-body continuum, which creates our capabilities of acting, of speaking, and so on, which is in the end of intelligence, and also global weather and global climate, which is just the aggregated weather over a longer period of time, are complex systems. So although we can create partial models of them, we can't create comprehensive models.
What, when it comes to AI, what would you say, you also write, those who invest in AI-based full automation projects such as driverless cars or transhumanist projects such as supposedly cognition-enhancing brain chips are facing or have already realized heavy losses. It's not financially healthy to confound science and science fiction. So you say, obviously there will be some use cases for AI that automates predictable patterns.
Yes.
So what's the good, the bad, and the ugly here?
Yeah, so basically already now we have a lot of applications of AI which work pretty well, like the spam filter, because the spammers use relatively repetitive patterns to create their spam emails. So that works relatively well. Because the spam filters are modeling a very small proportion of human cognition, which has to do with sexuality and money. That's what the spam emails are about, right? And that's why they can be relatively easily filtered. A very big example is the usage of AI for surveillance, because the human face, human gait, and also the way that human bodies interfere with Wi-Fi's creates patterns that are characteristic of an individual, perfectly characteristic. Also, this Wi-Fi thing is very interesting. was just published. And you can now use AI to basically identify human being perfectly by the face, by the gait, but also by the way the human being interferes with the Wi-Fi. So when you are at an airport and once your Wi-Fi interference pattern has been captured, the next time they can identify you. So this is, for example, a very typical case where AI can be used really well because the pattern has a high regularity and at the same time individuality, like a fingerprint. Another example is warfare. So now the Ukraine war, not so much the Gaza war, because the Gaza war is a war of highly industrialized and sophisticated military against peasants, right? But the Ukraine war is a war of two powers, the United States and a bit of NATO against Russia, who basically both have very sophisticated AI in the battlefield, right? So especially in two areas, in the areas of sensors, to understand what's going on the battlefield with many, many different modalities of sensors, but also for missiles, right? To control the trajectory of missiles. Because now the Russians have a lot of missiles that don't have a ballistic flight pattern anymore. So ballistic flight pattern means that you shoot off a rocket and it flies like this. And when you measure like a parabola, and when you measure 2 points on this trajectory, you can predict the rest of the trajectory. Then you can shoot down the missile. That's how the Iron Dome works. But when there is no ballistic pattern of flight anymore, you cannot shoot down the missile, or it's very hard to shoot it down. And all of this works with AI. So AI has many, many important applications, peaceful and non-peaceful. But especially the big hype is around those large language models like ChatGPT, and they don't deliver on their promises. So they will lead to huge failures of investments. But I think that the most clever investors have factored this in, and they are basically promoting this hype for a different reason. They're promoting this hype to create a total network of digitization and AI over the planet for surveillance and control. And for this, AI works really well.
Yeah, you conclude in that chapter, you say the West ought to avoid China-like applications of digitization to suppress us, the free citizens living under the rule of law. But unfortunately, I assume you'd agree, we're just seeing this continue across the world, across the entire planet.
Yes.
Moving on, I guess, from AI, you've got the climate hype as well. Well, you've got AI, and then you've got the sections on planet hype and transhumanism, and effectively you say there will be no singularity.
Yes. So all these chapters you are now quoting are part of the first part of the book, which is about scientific hypes. The second part is about cultural hypes. And maybe to before I go into answer this question, to say something important from the introduction. So basically, if you believe in physics and the validity of physics, all the chapters of the scientific hype part, you can only agree with. The second part, which is about cultural hype, you can only disagree if you're postmodernist. So if you are culturally postmodernist, then you would disagree with the chapters. But if you are basically traditional Western liberal, not in the sense of the modern American liberals, but a traditional Western liberal who believes in David Hume or Locke or Immanuel Kant's philosophy of the state, then you will also reject the hypes of the second part of the book. So this is how the book is structured. Now, to answer your question, so yes, of course, the singularity will not happen because it would require a machine that has consciousness, a will, and intelligence superior to human beings. But we cannot engineer any of those. We cannot engineer consciousness. We cannot engineer will. We can't engineer intelligence. So we cannot obtain a machine that can become more intelligent than us, or there will not be the singularity. It's a real nonsense idea.
And then climate. Again, I think a lot of us in this space, we have read so many of the books, and we've talked to so many people. I've had Lord Monckton on and others, yes. And it's just obvious at this point that it's really about the control, which you touch on. You go through that chapter, but then you write, quote, "For the oligarchic elites of the West, which possess 70 to 90% of the means of industrial and agricultural production, the climate and renewable energy policies result in an increase of their power based on the emerging scarcity of energy resulting from it. With lower amounts of energy available, the power of those who control its production and distribution increases. This does not imply that the policy is consciously malign. It is rather a natural policy in a situation of extreme wealth concentration." So, thoughts on that. And then you also say that we're going to need a lot more energy for growth to defeat poverty and what we were discussing previously for automation and digitization to continue shaping our high density civilization.
So if you assume that the people who promote the renewable energy hype and promote the climate hype that justifies renewable energy have a rational plan, let's assume this, then what they would do is first kind of move a lot of Western countries to renewable energies, basically to destroy the economy and their means of production, and then to do some kind of reset, right? And to rebuild these countries in a way, but it's a type of warfare. I mean, in Germany, hundreds of thousands of people now get laid off because all the time millions are losing their jobs over time because the factories have to shut down because the energy costs are too high. The politicians know this. I don't think it's actually there is an agenda behind this, and I don't think it works very well. But domestically, they thought it could work domestically within the West because they thought maybe they can increase their power and their control over society. But it doesn't work internationally because China and Russia are not following this path. They are building nuclear plants. They are burning coal and oil like hell. So they are basically, and the industrial output of an economy is correlated to more than 95% with CO2 emission. So that means that basically for warfare, you need to burn fossil fuels. Otherwise, you cannot conduct wars. So basically, at some point, the US is already now going back to burning fossil fuels and they're giving up renewable energy. But Europe wants to prepare for war, as they tell us every day. But at the same time, they want to have a green energy that's not compatible, and at some point they will be forced to make a choice.
How do you think this all ends then? Does the West then come to their senses, you think, eventually? So
if the West doesn't come to its senses, I think the most likely scenario that we know from history is that we be subjugated by another foreign power. And so this is the most likely scenario. The US will be last to be subjugated because they have this privilege on living on an island, gigantic island. But Europe will be, I don't think the Russians and Chinese will invade us, but they will just, if we continue like this, they will realize that Europe has still a lot of high quality people to offer, right? If you even say only a quarter of the European population is high quality, it's still 125 or 150 million people. So we can use these people for our purposes. And then you can, in a way, neo-colonize Western Europe or Europe. And this is, I think, the most likely scenario. If we don't wake up and change these mad self-harming policies, which are in the short-term interest of a tiny majority, but not even in their interest in the midterm. If we don't reverse these policies, we will come under foreign rule. And we Europeans have been under US rule in the West ever since 1945, so I know what foreign rule is. But for the most of this time, it was relatively benign. It has been less benign over the last 10, 15 years, but most of the time it was rather benign. But a rule by China or Russia could be much less benign. So I don't feel comfortable about this. And maybe the most important aspect of this is the short-termness of the way the elites act. It's like the popes in the Renaissance, they were so keen on extracting money from the citizens with these letters of indulgence, with the letters of indulgence scheme, that they basically created a huge rebellion. And then once Protestantism broke out, within 20 years, they lost half of their taxpayers. Within 20 years, half of Europe stopped to pay taxes to the Catholic Church. That's enormous, right? So they eroded totally their own situation out of arrogance and short-term greed and short-term planning. And I think the Western elites of today are also locked into a short-term predator scheme that is even harming themselves, as you can see in the outcome of the Ukraine war.
Yeah, and
you see what I mean?
Yeah, and just to add to what you're saying, I think, as you say, if the West falls into gets subjugated by foreign interests, whether they're globalists somehow or the East,
Yes.
probably through economic means, as we see this China's primary modus operandi. But also, if we remember, in George Orwell's 1984, I believe I saw a map somewhere that in that world, Eurasia covered most of Europe. So maybe, the idea is Europe will fall under Russian or this Eurasian Union that's being built. Who knows? But just because we're on climate, I just want this was breaking news I saw late last night. The Pope the Catholic Pope Leo the 14th, is he from Chicago originally?
Yeah, I think he's really from your town, from your hometown.
Right. And so there was this climate conference with a giant ice cube, and they're basically praying to the weather god. And I was just researching, I was trying to make a quick quip. And apparently, Baal or Baal from the Old Testament was also known as the god of weather or climate. So I find it interesting that effectively the Pope is leading a prayer. I could interpret it as to Baal. It's a giant ice cube, and they're talking about the climate, and they're praying for the Earth. So I thought that was, I don't know. Have you seen this clip?
Yeah. So yes, I've seen it. I mean, if you look at the detail, I think he was praying for the Earth and the water cycles or something, but that he was putting this big symbol there is like a pagan way of acting, right? So it's a typically pagan way of acting to put an object. So in Christianity, you are only allowed to pray to God or to the Holy Trinity. If you're Catholic, you can also pray to the saints. Well, I'm Protestant, I won't pray to the saints, but it's all right. They are basically just an intermediate to the Holy Trinity, but you are not allowed to use objects in this way. So it is a very bad sign of let's say, the cultural evolution of the top layer of the church. I don't think that at the bottom they are all that rotten, but the top layer is quite decadent right now.
Yeah, I just thought because we're on climate, it was mind-blowing. To jump to transhumanism real quick, we touched on some aspects of that, but I really like how you included in your book at the start of the chapter, you said, quote, why do so many, including clever people like the shrewd billionaire Elon Musk, who, by the way, this morning they announced he might become the richest man ever, worth 500 billion. But you also continue to say, or the highly intelligent Russian president, Vladimir Putin, say they believe in transhumanism. And I try to make this point, I'd assume you'd agree, well, that there's no really good guys, that from east to west, Putin to Xi Jinping to Brussels to Washington to London to wherever, they all have globalist ideology. And we recently had that clip from a few weeks ago at the military parade in China with Putin and Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un, where they were discussing life extension and living to 150. So it seems like they, like their Western counterparts in Davos and whatnot, share that similar transhumanist ideology. And then you also say, you talk about the Corona Crown event, let's say, was clearly impelled by transhumanism with its stated intent to genetically modify those who received the medical intervention. And you say transhumanist dreams of digital immortality are just fanciful nonsense. These visions should not scare us. They're fantasies. Transhumanism is nothing but Neo-Lysenkoism. If people recall, it was that Soviet scientist, right, who was doing insane things. So you call it ideological pseudoscience. However, there is a danger. The dangerous aspect of transhumanism is, just as there was a massive danger in the eugenic ideology of the Nazis and Stalin. So going through this madness, a lot of people can get hurt. Yeah.
So let's first start with the beginning of what you said. So I believe that the entire elite of the Northern Hemisphere has bought into transhumanism. This is the ideology they share. They don't share the view on capitalism. They have real conflict. So I believe there's it's not a pseudo conflict. It's a real conflict in Russia. It's a conflict for resources and minerals and also influence, regional influence. There is also a real conflict between Iran and Israel, where there are also powers of the Northern Hemisphere are opposing. So I don't believe they are all behind the scenes cooperating. This is a conspiracy theory, which I don't believe in. However, what is obvious is that they share a shared ideology in the same way that the medieval feudality also shared the ideology, a certain ideology, and which was the ideology of their honor, right? And then the bourgeois ideology was the ideology of dignity, which is of course a great idea. And now the third big ideology shared by the powerful people in the Northern Hemisphere is now transhumanism. So they all believe in it, even if it's anti-rational, anti-scientific, and even if they're very intelligent, because being intelligent is not enough. You have to really know the details of science to debunk this. If you don't know the details of science, it can sound really, if you extrapolate, like science fiction authors do, the progress of the last 20 or 30 years to the future, you can believe that this is going to happen. But these people don't understand the essential limitations of physics. If you understand them, and a very good example for this is the quantum chapter of the book, if you want to get into the details, where I cite some of the greatest physicists of our time to explain why the quantum hype is nonsensical. If you understand the physics, then you will not believe in this. But for them, it's not a matter of having to be sure whether this is right. It's just a big fashion. It's an ideology. And the ideology is very pernicious because let's look at a few examples. There's the COVID immunization schemes, which were deadly and killed, I believe, millions of people worldwide and harmed tens of millions or more. Made young people infertile and so on, which was terrible. There's another example, which is the hype around sex change surgery. And I mean, I believe that for adults, there is an indication for sex changing surgery for a very tiny proportion of people who really have a transsexual personality disorder. And they have to be carefully evaluated by psychiatrists, and a good society with a good social system can even pay for these people to have this kind of surgery. That has been done since the 70s. And I think, and these are very poor people. When I was working as a psychiatrist, I treated some of them, and they deserve our help, right? However, to do this to children who are driven into this by a fashion is terrible. That's also a form of transhumanism. And then another form of transhumanism is of course the whole idea to now switch all the vaccines to mRNA or nucleic acid based vaccinations. And so these are just a few examples of how dangerous this is and why we have to be aware of it. And this is one of the big motives I have to speak up, because I don't want to live in a world where toxic medicines and toxic procedures are imposed on the population. I find this it's extremely disgusting and compares to the worst periods of history.
Yeah, and just to go back to what you said, I'd agree with you. I often say that my view is that East and West, that the leaders share the same ideology. Putin, Xi Jinping, and the West when it comes to globalism and world domination, but they are like cartels that fight each other in Mexico, right? Exactly. So they're different factions. So they believe in the same thing, but they eventually want to rule the world. Or exactly. I often say that the West, in a way, promised the East the equal seat at the table, but then pulled the rug, I think, on the East. Yes. And now that's where the real, as you say, the conflict is real in Russia and elsewhere for control of resources. And just to add to what you're saying, we can't go through every chapter of your awesome book. We're going to skip the food hype section, but there's the one on medical hype, which is related medical technocracy and COVID, which you called the biggest fear hype in the history of mankind. I got a call just last week where yet another person that I know, now, out of the blue, onset of a very deadly cancer, and they got multiple injections. And so, yeah, it's continuing. But I really like what you said in the medical hype, medical technocracy section. Well, before COVID, I just wanted to say, in my early 20s, I snapped out of the medical hype. You're told you have to go to the doctor all the time, to the dentist for checkups, for this and that. And I'm like, I stopped doing that. Like, I haven't been a doctor in decades because I'm fine. You should be your own doctor first. Obviously, if you have something serious, you go. But just a little anecdote. When I was in Peace Corps Mongolia, I had one of my fellow volunteers. We both wear glasses. And I remember, because it's that medical hype. You got to listen to the experts. And when we go to the optometrist, we got to clean our lenses daily, right, Jobst, from the dirt and grime. And my colleague, he was like, I don't use anything except the spray that the optometrist sells me, the chemical toxic spray to clean my lenses. And I just thought that was kind of weird. And, later I saw someone simply use mild soap and water to wash it. And I'm like, why do I always have to buy this expensive spray? I can just use mild soap and water, which I do every day. So it's like, there's this hype. You got to just use what we tell you, the pills that we sell you. But then, just your general thoughts on medical hype. But I also like how you said that the pseudo pandemic seems to have been carefully planned and executed with the goal of rolling out a mass vaccination program globally, and thus enrolling the populations into a digital biomedical certificate scheme. And that was my conclusion in March or April of 2020, where I said it was basically to bring in global algocracy. So just some thoughts on my rant here and the medical technocracy hype.
So let's start with the last thing you said. It was from you that I learned had this idea that about the connection between the vaccination and the digital certificate as a means of suppression. I think you had an interview with this guy from Eastern Europe who's also a financial expert. I read his Substack. I will get his name back in a second. But anyhow, so this I learned via your podcast, right? So this was from your idea, and I just used it in the book just to acknowledge this, right? But what is, I think, the most important aspect of the book, of this chapter, which gave me a really cold shower. You know, I'm a physician, mathematician, and biochemist. And when I worked as a young physician, I was prescribing anti-HIV drugs, virostatics, to HIV positive patients. And what I learned during the so-called pandemic, I read the book by RFK Jr., the real Anthony Fauci, in which there's a chapter that says that HIV doesn't cause AIDS. And this is, of course, branded as a conspiracy theory of phonetics on Wikipedia. But I actually went into the scientific details. I read all the papers by the people who had been silenced by Fauci in the 80s. And I've concluded that they are probably right. And I can't go into the details now. You can read it in the book. But essentially, the pharmaceutical industry has been in a crisis since the late 70s, early 80s, because the pace of innovation has slowed down. And what we call in medicine outcome-relevant innovation has been declining very much. Outcome-relevant innovation is pharmaceutical innovation that really helps millions of people. Like for example, beta blockers did. Right, beta blockers are really life prolonging. They have side effects, but they add. If you are 60 and start taking beta blockers, you may become 80. But if you don't take them, you will die at age 63 or 65 from heart attack. So there are drugs that are really beneficial, but since the early 80s, not many more were coming out. Most of the innovation that came out since the early 80s was only for small minorities, and so there were still great innovations, but not for the masses. And so the pharma industry had to start to get a new revenue source. And one of them, there are several, but one of them is, I think, the HIV virostatics industry. And I believe that the red ribbon that is used as a symbol of HIV/AIDS, the solidarity ribbon, you know it? Yeah. It actually means, to bring it down to one sentence, I'm solidaric with the pharma industry slowly killing the people who take the virostatics without them having any usage for it, but the pharma industry making a lot of money from it. So the pattern of basically imposing medicines on the populations that don't help was exercised for the first time systematically in the 80s, and already in the 80s, scientists who contradict this, great scientists whom I quote in the book, were actually removed from their positions, removed from funding. They couldn't publish anymore. They were cancelled by the same Anthony Fauci, who did the whole thing 40 years later, again in COVID. And then in COVID, the rollout was much more massive, because instead of only prescribing these drugs to a small minority of mostly homosexual HIV positive patients, now you could give the vaccine to 4 or 5 billion people. But it was the same pattern. And I realized that already since the 80s, when I was still at college, at school, that already in the 80s, a similar scam had been happening. Neoleucine-esque scam had been happening with HIV, and that they have now scaled it up. And this was the biggest shock of my life. Because then I suddenly realized that the entire science in which I had been working all my life had been already corrupted in a key area very early on. You see the point?
Yeah, I mean, I perfectly, what you say, totally agree with your analysis. And I'm still thinking of the person. Was it Alex Krainer? Or I can't.
Yes, Alex Krainer. It's Alex Krainer.
His Substack, yeah.
Not everything he says is correct, but he has sometimes very brilliant insights.
My first interview with him, I think it was in 2020 or 2021, where he said the banking cartel is behind COVID. Yes. And I think that was one of my favorite interviews I did with him. Although I find him to be a little bit too much pro-BRICS, and he's got more optimism than I do, let's say.
I agree.
But
I agree, but he has very good. And I listened to that interview. And that was when I started listening to a podcast. And so the idea that this is part of an attempt, and you can see this because he said on one of the podcasts, the reason why the Russians and the Chinese had developed their own vaccines was not because they didn't want to use the Western ones, but they wanted to keep control over the combination of the drug and the certificate. And this is certainly true. This is a very clever insight. Now, this has failed the scheme, right? So they haven't been able to maintain the scheme because it was too extreme in the way it acted against the natural law and natural rights. But it shows you the cloth of which this is made, right?
Yeah, and maybe to turn towards the second part of your book, the culture hype. You mentioned quantum. I guess maybe we can, again, not enough time to cover that. People can read that as chapter 6. But globalism, my favorite topic, in the culture section. And you had a great quote by Martin Heidegger in the beginning. He says the historically visible signs of the essential completion of power are planetarism and idiocy. Planetarism means a relation of power to the entire earth in such a way that this relation is not the result of an extension of national power, but the beginning of a peculiar world government. You talk about H.G. Wells. Globalism as a continuation of Wells's campaign for socialism and world government. You say the global problems supposedly addressed by globalism are mostly imaginary or greatly exaggerated hype phenomena. I think that is a key quote. And then you also go in that chapter talking about, and I've thought about this a lot, but you're the first person that I've read that really fleshes this out, how we got here. And it's primarily, I think, through the 1800s and 1900s, where you say, quote, the concentration of wealth in the U.S. since the 1880s had created an absentee owner class accumulating an ever larger share of private property via huge oligopolistic structures in commodities, etc. And that eventually that power just has concentrated to a global level. And then you say that they feel now restricted by nation states, which they see as cost factors and obstacles to their economic performance. And they want to go one step further and believe it's better to rule the world using a centralized approach than via competing national jurisdictions. So thoughts on globalism?
Yes, so globalism is mainly an economic phenomenon, right? So because without the extreme wealth concentration that has happened in the last 150 years, there wouldn't be globalism in the way we have it, right? So it's mainly, and now globalism falls in two camps. Now there's Western globalism and Eastern globalism, and they are competing. The BRICS are trying to do Eastern domination of the world economy, and the West is trying to maintain its 500-year-old domination, which started basically in Genova, right? Very early on, was the first city that had colonies in North Africa and had a kind of small miniature globalist empire. And then this has been going on for 500 years, and the West has always been ahead of all the others. Now this is changing. So we have two opposing camps, but they both want to rule the world via economic power. And of course, they also need wars, as we can go to the war hype chapter later. But basically, it has to do with the wealth concentration. Without this massive wealth concentration of now, I would say maybe 300 families in the West owning 50% of the strategic property. So the strategic assets are the assets that you need to control the long tail of small property. So if you control certain relevant things like the media, like digital infrastructure, mining, and so on, power generation, when you own car makers, when when you dominate these sectors, you can basically control everything. And that's what's going on. I think that there are only a couple of hundred families left who control this. They are certainly organized in a certain way we don't know much about. But they are influencing publicly visible think tanks or NGOs like the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and many others. And your podcast is mainly about this, so I don't have to go into the details. But what I think matters and what is a bit original is in the way I tie this to the economic evolution. And a very important aspect of this is debt. Because without this huge debt system and this financial system we have, it wouldn't work. And I think this debt accumulation, which has allowed the West to cheat its way to economic power over the last 50 years, is about to collapse. And that's why I think that the East has better chances. Now, China is also indebted, but I think it can cope much better with the debt because it's so strong domestically, and Russia doesn't have any debt. Right. And so I think that the East is better prepared for a post-US dollar dominated world economy. And the debt has been the source. I explained the details in the book, has been the source of the wealth accumulation of the 50 years, but it also comes with the price of destabilizing the system itself.
Yeah, and I love what you say, that no one but the plutocrats needs a global governance. None of these organizations has any democratic legitimacy. They have no accountability towards the sovereign peoples of the democratic nations. And, I sometimes argue with friends and family in Croatia who believe in the European Union, others who believe in the United Nations. Sometimes on the street here in Mexico, they're collecting donations for like UN or UNESCO, and I just scoff at them. I'm like, what? No, are you are you serious? But just before moving on, I think you touch on this in the chapter, which is important. I haven't looked into this in great deal. I haven't done the podcast on it, but the Great Taking, right? David Rogers' Web.
Yes.
But you allude to, so you go through that economic history and how this has been done in the past through the gold confiscation in the U.S.
Yes.
But I'm just wondering, are they really going to do this? And even if they attempt it, will they really succeed? Because you talk about even, it's understandable if you have a mortgage and a debt and the hammer comes down, they crash the system, and then you can't fulfill your obligation on your mortgage, and then they take the collateral, they take your house. But I think it even talks about if you own outright your home, which like I do. I do have a physical title of my home and paper, but how you think they'll be able to take our assets out from under us?
So how it works, if you have assets that are in a bank, like you have a depot of titles of shares, right? Or bonds or something that is only exists digital, and the bank is going bust. Since 2008, we have legislation in the US and now also in the European Union that allows the creditors of this bank to take as collateral also the possessions that are held by the bank on your behalf as a private person. So this I'm quite sure that it will be possible to take this away. That's why I have accumulated a lot of savings in physical form, right? And a house in which you live is also hard to dispossess, right? So the only way to do that is like what the Germans did in 49, is actually to tax every house owner to pay 50% of the value of the house to erase the debt of the state, which was done, right? But I think it was only done for those owning at least two houses, because otherwise they would have created social unrest, right? But basically, it's possible to do that. And there are also other ways to confiscate, but the one I described with the houses is only done by the state and is only possible if there's a big support for the government. Otherwise, there's a rebellion. So you need, like in 49, there was a big support of the West German government by the West German population, because everyone was tired of the Nazis, and so in a way they accepted this. But if there is a situation of unrest, you can't do that. As to the confiscation of assets that are held by banks and other financial institutions on your behalf, I seriously believe that this is going to happen.
Yeah, like if you have on the bank account, we saw Cyprus bail-ins, and they're preparing basically that they can just confiscate what they want.
Yes, life insurance, what you have it, everything that's made out of paper.
Yeah. Going further, you've got the chapters on war hype, migration, death hype, the culture of death. You talk about the nature of evil. What else is important, you think?
So I think that the death hype chapter is important because it's the only one that brings in a theological perspective. You don't have to believe in God to read it, but I think that modern societies are bad at understanding the phenomenon of evil. Because if you're de-Christianized, the notion of evil doesn't make sense anymore to you. You need Christianity to define evil, or you could also have the Greeks. Aristotle had also the concept of evil, but that was also in a way connected to the creed of the Greeks, to the polytheism of the Greeks, right? So evilness in the Greek world was mainly disobeying the gods. And it's also the same in Christianity or Judaism. If you disobey God, you are committing evil acts. And I think we live now in a society in which public evil is very prevalent. And I think this is very rarely spoken about. Think of abortion. Especially, I think that there are some indications for abortion, like if the mother would die from the pregnancy, or if the child lacks a brain, or so. There are some exceptions. You can also discuss rape, right? Conception after rape, but this extreme expansion of abortion is one example of death hype. Another one is euthanasia. Now in Canada, they are very permissive laws for euthanasia that have led to a massive increase in state-performed euthanasias, which I think is terrible. I think last year there were more than 20,000 or something around 20,000 cases of euthanasia, which I think is despicable and a death-hype symptom. And then you have also Canada is a very good example. For example, in Canada, it is legal that a physician, a pediatrician, a child doctor prescribes fentanyl pills to children without the parents knowing. Now, the children will immediately become addicted, physically addicted, and it will damage their whole development. It's like giving small children alcohol, even worse, because fentanyl is even more addictive. It's terrible. There is no indication for this. It's absolutely disgusting. It's also, and many of them will later die from opioids. They will stay addicted. They will then overdose themselves later on, right? And so once they will be off the pills, they will take street fentanyl and then they will kill themselves, like George Floyd did, right? And so it's just terrible. And these are all symptoms of the death hype we live in, and evil. And this is a definition given by Martin Luther, but in the end also by Paul. Evil is the love for death and the hatred for life, and we see a lot of this in the West now.
Yeah, I mean, everything that you said is just death is upheld. It's just devaluing the worth of human lives. You know, as you said, they're introducing MAID programs, I think, in Scotland, everywhere across the West, and lowering the limits. So if you're like 18, if you're a kid and you just feel depressed, sign up for the states to take you out. And I want to give an example. I follow some, I mentioned this maybe in a previous podcast, but there was a clip. There's this Club del Narco Telegram channel, which publishes the atrocities here in Mexico. There was a recent video of, one cartel group. So some young Mexican man he was a grave robber. He raided the mausoleum grave of some deceased narco, and they caught him and they put him in a barrel, I don't know, with like a mattress, poured gasoline and lit him on fire. And were mocking and interrogating him, telling him, why did you, raid the grave of our narco friend? And he burned to death. He was flailing. The whole town could hear him scream. But just this nonchalant attitude of these people being able to sit here and watch as a man burns. I watched that video multiple times, kind of like I don't know what just something you don't see this stuff like this, but just to think another human being can do this without. It's that culture of death. And Santa Muerte, they have that.
Yes, Santa Maria de la Muerte.
Here in Mexico, it's part of that occult sort of death worship. But anyways, I did want to, without mention, the book is awesome. Highly recommend people go out and purchase it. The link is in the description to get it on Amazon. But on migration, you boil all this stuff down, and when it comes to migration, there's a great quote. You say, damaging migration, which occurs when the migration rate is higher than the assimilation rate, harms the target society as a whole. If non-integrating migrants dominate, as is now in the case where you live in Germany, the US, and many other Western countries, this leads to short-term benefits, of course, to several groups, landlords who let cheap accommodations to migrants, producers of fast-moving consumer goods, and so forth. But the money shot is, you say, the ruling class of the West is pro-migration, in fact, pro-damaging migration, because damaging migration, this goes back to globalism, erodes the formation of political will, and today's globalist elites want to rule via transnational organizations, reducing or abolishing political self-determination at the national, regional, or local level. And I like how you cite Peter Sutherland. I often cite as BBC News article. Just type in Peter Sutherland, BBC migration, and he was Bilderberg, UN, all these globalist institutions, where you say he openly stated that the purpose of migration into the Western Hemisphere is the inhibition of democratic political will formation by undermining national homogeneity. So I think you've boiled it down to its essence, no?
Well, I mean, one could argue that this is only one voice of the globalists, but it's certainly a representative voice, and a feeling that many have. There are also similar voices in Germany and France and so on. Yes, so the migration topic, what I say in the migration chapter, and I do this in all the chapters, I also look at the other point of view, which is that there is also very good migration, right? For example, you are an example. Your parents were great migrants. They enriched by coming to the United States. They enriched you were created there, which was good for the United States. Unfortunately, you had to leave, but now you are a good migrant for Mexico and so on, right? And so migration can be very positive. If there's assimilation, you have learned Spanish, you have assimilated to Mexico, you are a good citizen there, I assume, right? You're paying taxes and so on and so on. You are making sure that your neighborhood is clean and so on and so on. So there is a lot of positive migration. So I'm not anti-migration. I'm just against destructive migration. And I think that has to be taken into account. And I can also understand personally all the migrants who migrate out of poverty with the hope to have a better life. It just doesn't work, but I can understand them. So I'm not against them at the personal level. I also want to emphasize this, because it's often said, oh, these people who criticize migration are haters. No, I don't hate any of them. Rather, I feel pity for them that they have such a miserable life at home that they want to take such a risky trip, right? And so, but the problem is we cannot take in too many of them. So this is what I'd like to answer on this one. And there's much more details. I'm using a lot this great book by Collier, written 10 years ago about migration, which is absolutely still valid and an excellent book about this. He's an economist who wrote a fantastic book on migration at the time. Now maybe because the hour is soon finishing, I would like to say something about the last chapter of the book, if you don't mind.
Yeah, but just to add on migration, I look at examples of the Croats, my parents and other people that I've spoken to of their age, that I agree with you. I think people should look for legal routes to escape their situation. Yes. So yes. I mean, if you're in Mexico or some third world country, apply for visas to whatever surrounding countries. Croats that escaped Yugoslavia, they had options. They would have. People told me they'd get. They applied for France and Canada and Australia and USA, and the first to respond was Canada. So then they went to Canada or Australia, and so you always look for legal means to do this. Not to because I could never imagine myself living without papers in some foreign country. But as you say, jump to wherever you like.
Yeah, so I think because it deserves a bit of attention, let's look at the last chapter, which explains why we have all these types. And what I think is that this oligarchic rule under which we have fallen is illegitimate. And legitimacy can arise not only from democracy, but it mainly arises when natural law is respected, when there's a sense of participation, and when there's isonomy, so that nobody gets systematically mistreated by the courts of law. These are the three elements, main core elements, when Westerners feel that they live. This doesn't apply to China and Russia, but to the West it applies. This is when Westerners feel that they have a legitimate government, are these three components. And they can also be realized in a non-democratic state, like, for example, under Bismarck. Germany under Bismarck realized these three principles to a very high extent, although it was not a democracy, right? So you don't have to have a democracy to have a legitimate state, but what you need are elites who take the needs of the masses into account and who don't systematically abuse the masses. And now we have a situation in which the masses in the West get systematically abused more and more, and the legitimacy is plummeting. And to compensate for this plummeting legitimacy, instead of changing the way that the rulers deal with us, they basically tell these narratives of hype to buy into the system via fear. And in COVID, 30 to 40% of the West European populations were fanatically bought into what the state was doing because they were so afraid that they thought the state was saving them. So it works really well, right? It also worked during the Cold War. Russia never wanted to attack Western Europe, but it was portrayed to us that they wanted to do it, and that legitimized huge spendings for defense and so on that were completely harmful to most of the population, but that they were justified with this fear hype. So I believe that we are living now in a permanent state of emergency, where the hypes are used to basically hide the deficit in legitimacy. And a very interesting point was when they stopped COVID at the beginning of 2022, they immediately switched on Ukraine. And so. And I'm not talking about the Russians' attack, which was illegal, which I agree was illegal from the point of view of international law. But I'm talking about these flags everywhere. This total hype of Ukraine that was used to basically create a new wave of fear and of also means of identification for those who believed in the narrative. And we have this now in regular cycles. And I think this is very dangerous. And for me, the most interesting aspect of this is, why is this happening in democracies? Why is this not happening in Russia? Or why is this so specific to the West? And I believe that democracies are the least stable form of government that we can have. They are great if they work, but they are very unstable. If you're interested, I can elaborate why. And this essential instability of democracies makes them liable to this type of ruling with a state of emergency. And we had this actually from 1914 to 1945. All the continental countries of Europe were governed by a state of emergency. The United States and Great Britain went into a state of emergency as well during the Second World War. So it is very typical historically of democracies to do this when they are in crisis. And this is how I explain that these hypes are so prevalent and dominating our culture now.
Yeah, and I go back to the entrenched elites who have this oligarchy, and they seek further expansion and this totalitarian world state. And so they don't want, as you say, they don't want to lose their grip. So they're having to run these cycles of hype to maintain it, and then get back to continuing their expansion. And again, just want to read from your book, you say, we've arrived at a post-democratic system where you can call neo-feudalism, right? An unstable system. And you say the ruling neo-feudal minority, unlike the ruling minority of feudalism and absolutism, is hidden. It generates neither politicians nor public servants, but rules indirectly. And of course, you say it's fundamentally illegitimate. So, final thoughts, where do we go? So we're in this permanent state of emergency. It's been going on for a long time, so probably not going to stop anytime soon. What do we do? Where do we go from here?
So first of all, I would like to make one distinction. So in feudalism, there was a huge knowledge and feeling of responsibility for the serfs among the ruling class, because they knew they depended on them, and they also knew, especially in early feudalism, if they mistreated their serfs, the serfs would just leave and work for someone else, right? So there was a feeling of responsibility and also mutuality, which has to do with the deep history of how feudalism evolved. And during absolutism, the top nobility has lost this connection to the population. That's what was driving the British and French revolutions in the 17th and 18th century, and also the American Revolution in 1776. And now again, we have an elite that is totally detached from the needs of the masses and arrogant and sees the mass as superfluous. This is a very dangerous trend. Now, I'm not looking to kind of hide myself or leave, but I think the best thing we can do is what we are both doing. Explain to the people in a rational, composed, and calm manner what's going on, with avoiding, mirroring the irrationality of our opponents. I'm not going to say it's a big conspiracy. I'm saying it's a spontaneous macroeconomic and cultural evolution that is being utilized by very clever people like Henry Kissinger and his followers. But it's not that they are sitting in the Blofeld center and pushing buttons and guiding the world. It's not like Ernst Blofeld in the Bond movies. But it's a very complicated, spontaneous evolution into which we have come. And so this is what I want to highlight. And so we have to talk about this. We have to rationally explain what's going on, and we have to help people understand it. That's what we both do in the ways that we can best do. And this is what we should continue doing. And I'm a Christian, so I believe that God is supporting us. So in the end, I'm still optimistic. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this.
There's that Jesus white pill that I talk about. And I have to mention, just to add to what you're saying about what we need to do, which is what we're doing. I included it in my weekly analysis just now for paid subscribers, but it's also posted on my socials, that there was this young man, Mexican businessman, Compa Moy is his nickname, Moses, is it Moisier. He worked hard, blood, sweat, and tears, and created a very successful restaurant business in Mexico, 4 years. And the cartels came and demanded the slavery, basically, to give him all of give them all of his profits every month, the extortion. And he said he gave this 10-minute video with English subtitles. People can watch it, where he says, I have to close. It's so sad that I have to close my business because I'm worried I'm going to get whacked by a sicario, an assassin that's going to come into my business and shoot my customers and kill me. So I have to shut down. But he said this is happening all over Mexico. The government knows it. They're complicit. They don't do anything. But, and he's implying that other Mexican citizens and Mexican businessmen are cowardly. They're quiet. If enough people begin to speak out and create this noise of Mexican businesses being extorted by the criminal cartels, that will put the ball in the court of the government and force them to act, yes. Which is, I think, precisely what your court of sort of yes. alluding to, no?
Yeah, I mean, two great men of the last 150 years, Albert Schweitzer and Mahatma Gandhi. Because they both said that injustice must be countered by passive opposition, right? It often suffices to just do what you're legally forced to do and nothing more, to bring a system down, right? So it's really this peaceful opposition of only doing the very bare minimum that you have to do. And if the more people, even this is already a lot, right? And if more people do this because they understand what's going on, then a lot can change. So I still believe that, but the key to change is what I call the executive class, the top 10% that rule on behalf of the top 1 per mil. And this executive class, I wrote this book for the executive class because they must understand what's going on. And they must stop believing in the narratives. For them, believing in the narratives is nice because it justifies their existence and the way they act. But they are seeing more and more disadvantages. Like now, people from the executive class of my country have bought into all the narratives of the last 20 years. Now say, I don't want my children to be killed in a war against Russia that makes no sense. So they slowly, the closer it gets to their own field of life and to their lives, they start to realize something is wrong. So we basically have to disagree and show passive resistance, but always in a law-abiding and peaceful way. Because if you look at history, the big changes never came by violence, but they came by the elite of the society, the executive class, giving up on a system of rule. Like, for example, the French Revolution did only harm, but the way that things became better is when the French bourgeoisie realized that they have to get rid of Napoleon in 1811. They did this without any violence. They spied for the Britons, they financed the British war in Spain against Napoleon, and they brought Napoleon down. And I think this is the right pattern. So the right pattern is not blood, but the right pattern is that the executive class must understand that something is wrong. And if they don't follow the tiny elite anymore that is directing them, then things can change.
And I think that's a great point you make as well, how in Germany, in Europe, in the US, in the West, that executive class is now, they have to worry about, is their child going to be sent to war? Is their child going to chop off their genitalia or sign up for a maid program or, I don't know, inject themselves with, yes. Mysterious elixir. Yes. And then again, the example here for Mexico, where the executive class, where if they allow this cancer to grow, they're going to start being kidnapped and killed. And it's like that meme of the dog sitting in with the coffee and everything is burning and he says everything is fine. Well, it's like, no, the whole thing is going to collapse. So either yes. do something now to save us. And so it's always great catching up, Jobst or Arnold. The final thought, best places people can find you. They can get I'll link your other book on that we talked about previously, and as well as they can get the Hype Cycle. So where's the best place for people to go?
You can just Google my name and you find my publication. So I'm not kind of shadow banned by Google, so that's the easiest way. I don't use social media very much, but if you Google my name, you will find my publications usually.
All right, I highly recommend the book, and I look forward to future conversation, Jobst.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, Herr Voy. It was a big pleasure.